School of Business Alumni Webinar. Today's topic is how cutting trash in half can save money and green our cities. My name is Sarah Stafford, and I'm a professor of economics, public policy, and law here at the college, and I currently serve as director of the Thomas Jefferson Program in public policy. Today is the first of what we hope will be many webinars that are jointly sponsored by the Mason School of Business and the Jefferson Program in public policy. Joining me on this webinar today are three individuals that I would like to introduce now. First, we have John Campbell, who is the chairman of Waste Zero. Previously, John served as the co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Campbell Alliance, a leading specialized management consulting firm that was sold in 2011 to Inventive Health and Thomas H. Lee Partners, a Boston-based private equity firm. In 2006, John was named as an Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year. John has his MBA from the College of William & Mary and his BA summa cum laude from Pace University. We also have with us today Mark Dancy. Mark is the president of Waste Zero and a member of its board of directors. In May 2012, the South Carolina Department of Commerce recognized Dancy as the South Carolina Ambassador for Economic Development. Mark also received his MBA from the College of William & Mary, where he and John met, and he has a bachelor's degree in economics from the George Washington University. And finally, we have George Campbell, who is no relation to John. George is the former mayor of Portland, Maine, and has served as commissioner of both the Maine and the New Hampshire Departments of Transportation. He's a member of Waste Zero's executive advisory group. During George's tenure as mayor, Portland instituted its successful pay-as-you-throw program in 1999. In the private sector, George has led multiple successful public-private partnerships. George has his master's and bachelor's degree in public administration from the University of Maine. Our three speakers will be presenting on a powerful waste management policy solution called Pay-as-you-throw. Pay-as-you-throw leverages behavioral economics and can work to solve the nation's garbage crisis, cutting trash in half and thus having a tremendous positive impact on both municipal finances and the environment. Waste Zero is the nation's leading waste reduction company, helping more than 800 cities and towns around the U.S. cut their trash utility pricing for almost 25 years. So without further ado, let me turn the presentation over to John Campbell.
Sarah, thank you so much. I can't tell you what a privilege it is for Mark and I and George to be here today talking with you about this very unique business and very unique program that we run. And it's coming home for us. It's coming home to a place where we thought a lot about what we were going to do with our lives, and it's thrilling to be able to step back here today and say, we think we're doing our piece to move the needle. In terms of the program for today, we thought it would be useful to walk you through exactly what we would present to a city or town. In this case, the sort of case study that we're going to use is Fall River, Massachusetts. For those of you who aren't familiar with Fall River, it's a city of almost 90,000 people. Median household income is about $35,000. It's a city where 40 to 50% of the population English is a second language. So it's a city that it's a wonderful city, and also a city that has, like many of the cities we work with, faced its fair share of challenges. And so if we sort of turn the clock back to April or so of last year, Mark, my partner, who's going to be presenting in a moment, was talking with the council from exactly this presentation deck, if you will, and explaining to them what we do, and starting with, as we do in every city council meeting, in every public meeting, the fact that our mission, we are a mission-driven company, is to cut the trash in half in the United States. And that, frankly, sets people back on their heels. There's a certain amount of disbelief when you talk about the fact that any program might achieve that kind of result. But in Fall River, they knew that we could do it because we've worked with over 100 cities and towns in Massachusetts and effectively done that. And so we recapped for them the fact that we've been running these kinds of waste reduction programs for almost 25 years, that on average we've reduced solid waste by 44%, and that all of the cities and towns using programs that we've designed and implemented are still up and running successfully. So it feels, frankly, spectacular. We've also had lots of cities and towns that have started a program on their own and then decided to turn management of that over to us. So as you mentioned, Sarah, we now have 800 cities across 41 states working with us. Last year, we became certified as a B Corp. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the B Corp movement, it basically clarified in our charter that we exist, of course, at some point to earn a profit so that we can continue to do our work. But our charter says that we'll do that only when we achieve the goals laid out in our public-private partnerships of achieving meaningful waste reduction in our partner community. So it's a significant change. We were also chosen as among the top 10 B Corps in the United States with 7th generation Patagonia. So for a relatively small company compared to the others, that was quite a distinction in Forbes magazine. So in Fall River, as in every city, we have to frankly start at the beginning because the trash is being collected and it's being made to go somewhere. No one quite knows what's going on with it, and so we have to begin even with city council members to say that we're talking about trash for a reason. We're talking about something that truly is both an environmental and a financial nightmare for not just for Fall River, but for every city and town virtually in the United States, save the 800 that we've implemented the program with. The fact is that we have a system in place that encourages among residents a tremendous amount of wasteful behavior, a tremendous amount of taxpayer resource that is going to operate a solid waste system and could instead be more productively used to educate our kids in the school system, to pave roads, to build infrastructure, to undertake economic development. So running an inefficient solid waste system is one thing, but we have to think about it in the context of what we're not doing, the opportunity cost, if you will, of all that money that's being thrown away. And unlike many other things that the Fall River Council hears about, because they hear about problems every day. They hear about an underfunded pension, or they hear about some sort of infrastructure crisis. Well, in this case, when we go to the council, the good news is we tell them this is a problem that we can solve immediately, and we know that the solution will work. And so it's a nice position to be in after 24, 25 years. So we thought that we would include in this meeting, even though our time is limited, a few of the big picture slides that we share with council people and sometimes in a presentation to residents. And that's just simply to say, if you look at the blue line, we'd like everyone to understand the magnitude of the problem. If you look at the period between 2000 and 2010, you'll see that we slowed down the rate of acceleration with regard to solid waste, but it continued to grow. And now that the single stream recycling and recycling systems in general are in place at the curbside in most cities and towns in the United States where it's going to happen, it's all about population growth. And we don't have another intervention behind the recycling infrastructure that we put in place. So we're headed toward 560 billion pounds of trash that we will generate as a country. We are by far the most wasteful society on the planet, and it's catching up with us. At the same time, as a country, if you turn back the hands of time back to the 80s, it's sort of behind this chart timeline, but we had at one time 8,000 landfills, and we have closed 6,000 of them, so that we have 2,000 left. That was a very significant change in our country. And what's happened is that's caused us to drive the trash that we generate, sometimes across 7 or 8 state lines, to make it disappear, or to a very high cost incineration facility that's bad for the environment, as we'll talk about in a moment. On slide 9 here, on the red line, you can see the consumer price index and quite vividly see on the blue line that the cost of trash is accelerating at roughly twice the rate of the consumer price index. So if your city or town were spending 5 or 6% of the budget 20 years ago, now you're spending perhaps 10 or 11 or 12%. And once again, the point is we're not educating children. We're sending that money to the landfill. It's not being used for any productive public purpose. And so that makes it particularly painful for all of us to watch. Now, in the time that we have here today, we frankly don't have enough time to get into all of the dangers of burying and burning trash. Okay, I don't know how many of the folks who are tuned in here today have ever visited a landfill, or if any of you happen to have lived or had a family member live near an incinerator, but it's horrific. Okay, and even though the EPA's taken steps to try to improve through a set of rigorous standards, the liners and the other infrastructure around draining the toxic leachate and so forth, the reality is common sense would tell all of us if we could avoid sending half the trash to a landfill and leaving it there to cause a problem in terms of groundwater contamination or another environmental problem for a future generation, we'd like to do that. Okay, we'd certainly like to avoid that and the costs associated with it. Astounding, again, this is sort of the last piece of the big picture in terms of resources. Astoundingly, even though most of the country, vast majority of us have access to recycling, we still as a country send 59 billion pounds of recyclable paper to the landfill and 63 billion pounds plastic and 6 billion pounds of aluminum. So it's staggering how much waste is going to the landfill that could be recycled, and there's a truck passing by the homes to collect this material. Also, many people don't make the connection between the reprocessing of that material. If residents chose the recycling bin over the trash bin and it were diverted in a material recovery facility, there'd be enough BTUs recovered to power a quarter of the houses in the United States. Okay? It's a lot of energy, if you will, in the trash. And finally, for people who think about carbon, there's an equivalent carbon emission to removing 1 in 5 cars from the road. So there are a group of folks, myself included, who are tuned into and thinking about climate change. This intervention, if you will, of cutting the trash in half has the potential to be the most significant intervention that any city or town could undertake. In the case of every city and town we've implemented, it has been the most significant environmental program they've ever implemented, and it will be, frankly, for many decades. Why do we have the problem? I'm going to set the table for my partner Mark Dancy's discussion. The reason that we have the problem is quite simple. It's not that we don't have infrastructure, because clearly we have trucks collecting material. Clearly, in most cases, we have a large container. We have recycling education. We have a material recovery facility. We have everything that we need. What we don't have is the right set of incentives. We don't have a utility pricing structure for solid waste. Okay? So think about it. With electricity or gas or water, all of those utility systems have been metered. We've put in place an incentive to make the resident, the user, a partner in conservation. But we've not done that with trash. In most cities and towns, you can leave as much trash at the curb as you would like and run up the bill for the city and your fellow residents without any financial consequence whatsoever. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and business partner, Mark Dancy, to talk about some of the specifics of our waste reduction programs.
Thank you, John, and it's great to be back in Williamsburg. And just to jump from where John was talking about to something a little bit specific, thinking about our own experience with the way we handle trash at our house, and most of us have this similar type experience. We pay for our trash. Make no mistake, it has a cost, but we pay for it through our taxes or for a flat fee. And as John mentioned, it traditionally hasn't been metered. And the way we try and get people to reduce trash is step two. We ask people. We say, please recycle. We spend a lot of money on promoting recycling education, and it has had some effect. But that effect is negated almost entirely when at the end of the curve every week we can put out as much trash as we want. We say in the slide, we say a blank check. I like to call it the all-you-can-eat buffet type system. But essentially, if we were trying to get people to use more trash, how would you do that? You'd make it free. And so we are basically incentivizing a public bad with the existing system in most communities. But if we look at how a pay-as-you-throw system works, in a pay-as-you-throw system, we have we look at cutting the flat fee, and most people in public policy laugh when I say this, or reducing taxes, because nobody ever believes that's going to happen. But changing the fee structure and then having a fee per bag of trash. So our system is based on, rather than, since you can't have a meter on the side of the house that says how much trash you threw away, the way that we've learned how to do this in an effective way is to say the trash has an imprint, the trash bag has an imprint on it with the city's logo. There is a charge for each of those bags. The charge can be $1, or as the example we have, $2. The city sets the rate, much as they would for a water utility. It's basically by the gallon. So a 30-gallon bag of trash now costs $2 per bag. And the city will only pick up the bag if that fee has been paid, if it's in the appropriate city bag. That immediately changes behavior. Because now, rather than being incentivized to put as much at the curb as you want, or at least in the old system, now you're incentivized to do what's right, and that is to get as much out of that bag, as much out of the trash, and as much out of the city's cost structure as you can. You're, as John said, a true partner with the city, because the financial impact is on you personally. And it is amazing what happens with the results when we do that. And I say amazing because we say this number casually, but in the cities and towns that we've worked with over 20 years, when the program is priced properly and implemented properly, the average waste reduction is 44%. And I say that again because if we could take any other city service, if we could take fire, police, schools, parks, and not change the service level, but decrease the cost by 44%, that would be phenomenal. People work on 1%, 2% savings. This is a game changer because we've now asked the public to participate. As a direct result, recycling rates increase, not just municipal recycling rates, but also goodwill, also electronics recycling, all the things that aren't considered municipal recycling, but are in fact recycling, and items that are not supposed to go into the waste stream in the first place. People suddenly become very aware of what the rules are and where they can take things and items that should never have been part of the city's expense and part of their trash to begin with. And these results happen immediately. We'll show you again the specifics on what we predicted for Fall River and what actually happened, but they are not unusual. They happen within 30 to 90 days, and they are permanent. So the cities that we as a company have been involved with and started, we have 0 that have ever gotten out of this system. So, and that includes cities that have done this for 20 years. So if you can make a policy change that's impactful enough to reduce waste by 44%, that will take effect in 30 to 90 days and have that impact and then last for 20 years. That's what we get to sell. The challenge, of course, is that when you're selling something and you're explaining something to people, there's a lot of education and a lot of change. So even though the value proposition is incredibly clear and the trash always drops and the recycling always increases and the goals are always met, the challenge is how do you communicate that and how do people respond to that communication. So as a company, we look at our relationships as long-term. We say public-private partnerships, but we've been doing this long before that was kind of the buzzword of the day. We commit to cities up front by doing all kinds of community support, education prior to an implementation of a program. And then we deliver our program services, which are the supplies, the distribution network, all the things that we could go into and spend a separate hour on if people wanted to know all the details of what we do. But essentially what we do is we look at, this is really our business, is to look at the municipality and say, this isn't your business. Your business isn't implementing pay-as-you-throw programs. Your business isn't administering and running pay-as-you-throw programs. That's what we take off their hands and offer a turnkey solution to cities and towns. And here's the key thing. I mentioned that change is difficult and the idea of change is difficult. Prior to implementation of programs, there's a lot of hand-wringing that goes on and concern about a variety of things that might go wrong, including the results might not be there, or people are suddenly just going to dump their trash on the side of the road. There are all these concerns prior to a startup. But again, with a 100% success rate in 20 years of history, we know that a month after the program starts, it works. And suddenly, the public policy, the public communications part becomes much easier because you're showing tangible results, you're showing real savings, and you are showing, and people are doing it and experiencing it themselves. And they're saying it's not that difficult when it's implemented properly. It's really not that hard. And you're not taking anything away from them. If residents still want to throw away more than they should, they just have to pay for it. And that's the same in every other aspect of their life. If they want to drive, a Hummer instead of driving a Chevy Volt, they're going to pay for more at the pump. And that's what they have to do. They're going to spend more money. And I think people understand that intuitively because it's what they do in the rest of their lives. So the results, what are the results? There's a public policy polling survey done last year with 1,000 participants in pay-as-you-throw cities that had already passed that hurdle, started the program up. And the results were remarkably favorable since we were essentially asking people, the poll was asking people, how do you feel about this fee? And you can imagine most people intuitively, you would think people don't like fees. But the results were that 89% of residents had a somewhat favorable or very favorable reaction to about pay-as-you-throw. That, again, the vast majority of people found it to be more effective or as effective or more effective than they anticipated. And so, people can see their behavior changing. And then the real question, the last question is, what's the political impact? Are you more or less likely to vote for those who voted to implement a program like this? And the majority thought it made no difference to them, which I think is probably a good thing. And were more likely to vote for politicians that had implemented than those that were less likely to vote. So overall, something that I think is very much in the mindset of most politicians who ultimately have to vote for a program like this. They can understand the value proposition for the city or town. They can understand the long-term savings. They can understand the environmental impact. But they need to know, and which is the case in almost all of our towns, that their political career is going to continue. So, and we found that it does. And that brings me to the Fall River case study specifically. The slide you're looking at right now is the slide we showed Fall River in the spring of last year. We projected that they would reduce their waste by 44% and that their recycling would increase accordingly. And that they would receive in tipping fee savings, which is what they pay to bury their garbage, an $800,000 annual savings. And so the town of Fall River had to set a budget. And in that budget, they had to say, what would our net revenue be for bag sales? And we told them $2.7 million. We told them $800,000 in tipping fee savings, net $3.5 million. They budgeted that line item into their city budget. They retained the 35 firefighters that they had. The alternative was to lay off 35 firefighters, and they retained those men and women with the $3.5 million that we committed to them. So now we're on the hook because we're on the public record for what's going to happen. What's going to happen both financially and environmentally, and obviously looking out in the long term, significant savings in the long term, just in tipping fees, and there are other savings the city may enjoy as well. We just didn't factor those into the budget. And then what are the environmental impacts of that reduction in waste? As John mentioned, there are models that trying to determine when you take aluminum, use the example, out of the trash, and you use aluminum through recycling rather than mining new aluminum, there is energy savings, there's CO2 savings. So again, the EPA has done extensive work on trying to figure out when there is this dramatic change in where materials go, how does that impact energy and CO2. So those are part of the projections. And so what were the results? Well, we projected 44% waste reduction. We hit 43.1% in the first 90 days. So that was the cumulative over 90 days. So we expect to do a little bit better than that. Net financial impact of $3.5 million, even prorated for the startup, we will exceed the $3.5 million. Be pretty much dead on, but exceeded a little bit for budgeting purposes. And if we're reducing the waste, the environmental numbers are on track as well. So this is not unique for us as a company, and it is not unique, as John mentioned. The demographics of Fall River are, English is a second language for many folks in the city. There is a lot of lower income folks that live in Fall River. A lot of challenges that you might think, okay, well, it won't work in Fall River, but it did. And we hear the same thing in towns that are wealthy. They'll say, well, it won't work here. And we'll hear the same thing in suburban cities or in rural locations. It won't work here, except the fact is it works everywhere. We'll hear people in the South say it won't work. So, but it does. Economics and putting price into the supply and demand curve affects people's behavior, and it's amazingly predictable. So just to touch on a little bit more about the politics and how the public policy angle folds into this, George Campbell, who is an advisor to Waste Zero, and the former mayor of Portland, Maine, who personally implemented the program. I'll turn it over to you, George.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Do you want to address some of the questions?
Yes, why don't we do that?
Okay.
This is John Campbell speaking. Sarah, is there any particular order you'd like me to take these in, or?
Yeah, let me start with the first question that a couple of people have asked about, kind of related, is we're saying that the important thing here is to change people's behavior. So let's put prices on this. Let's talk about the supply and demand curve really having these implications. But once we put a price on throwing out your garbage, how do you deal with people who then don't want to pay the price? So in particular, what do you see in terms of, is there an increase in illegal dumping? And how do you deal with things like apartment buildings where it's hard to track whose trash it is? So could you address that?
Sure. This is Mark, Dancy. Great questions, and the first two we usually are asked, so perfect. The illegal dumping is one of the things I talked about, the hand-wringing prior to this. One of the interesting things, again, to stick with Fall River, we had a council member say, let me be the first to say I'm not going to support this because our city is going to end up looking like a dump. And 3 months into the program, it doesn't. And it was interesting. We had a gentleman in the room with us who had been the Public Works Commissioner in Worcester, Massachusetts for 21 years, where they started their program 20 years ago. And he was the person who started it, saw it through 20 years, and said unequivocally we had no more illegal dumping. Many people don't know Worcester and Fall River, but I will tell you that if you don't have illegal dumping in those two cities, you're not likely to have it anywhere. It gives me faith in humanity that for $1 or $2 a bag, people don't become litterers. that doesn't inspire people to become litters. I think, and so it's just a matter of evidentiary experience that it doesn't happen. However, the question about illegal dumping comes up in every single meeting. As soon as it's brought up, and every day up until the program starts, but a month after it starts, we never hear about it again.
This is George Campbell speaking, and in Portland we had the same experience. We didn't have an increase in illegal dumping, and one of the reasons is that we're talking about municipal solid waste here. Municipal solid waste is solid waste that is defined specifically by ordinance in Portland, and I assume most communities across the country, as residential waste. Residential waste is defined as properties with under 4 apartment units in those properties. So we're not serving large apartment complexes, but we're actually, in the case of Portland, we have 62,000 residents, 55,000 are served by the municipal solid waste system. And so therefore you don't have dumping because you have your neighbor next door who's paying for the bags, and if you're not, they're going to self-police.
And this is John Campbell. Next week I will visit 14 to 16 of our cities and towns. We will open every meeting asking, what's your experience been? Have you had any problems? In the 3 years that I've been with the company, I've not heard a single city say that they've had a problem with illegal dumping or contamination in the recycling or any of the other things that people worry about. It just simply does not happen.
So the multi-unit apartment buildings, the businesses, all of these are doing their own contracting separately, and they're already probably paying on some sort of per unit basis.
Generally speaking, so you have your exceptions. New York still collects from apartment complexes, and Mayor Bloomberg was a big fan of pay-as-you-throw, but there was, we did not have a way to handle those types of complexes. Boston still collects from multifamily, but the majority of cities, as George said, have gone to a model of if you're over 4 or maybe 6 units in the complex, you become a commercial entity, and then you have to go and contract. Typically, you'll use a dumpster or some other method, but if it'll be a private hauling situation, and most of these ordinances wouldn't cover that type of building.
This is George Campbell. I just step back in and say the commercial apartment or commercial business is actually paying because they are paying for the hauler specifically and for the tipping fee themselves to the landfill or to the waste incinerator, whereas the residential waste is not paying. It's buried in the tax bill. So there becomes a real fairness about this in terms of if you live in an apartment building, you're paying through your rent for this service, but if you're living in a residence, you're not unless you put in pay-as-you-throw system.
So another question that kind of gets to a little bit of the mechanics before we let George come back in and talk a little bit more about the politics is that can this only work in cities where they already have a recycling program in place? And then what other options do you work with cities to think about alternatives so it's not just recycling as an alternative to trash, but also increasing composting or other things like that?
This is John Campbell. I'd be happy to answer that question. The vast majority of the cities that we serve, like Fall River in the case study, already have some sort of curbside recycling program in place. Most of the time these days it is single stream, that is commingled recycling. And so that makes it frankly even more astounding that we're achieving the waste reduction number on top of, in Fall River, a city that had already been well served by a curbside recycling program. There are a few cases, there are a few places in the U.S. where they have not yet instituted curbside recycling. Waterville, Maine was a city that we implemented last year, about 17,000 people. When we're coming to town, in the case of Waterville, we actually funded curbside recycling for everyone as part of our program. And there we achieved an astounding 55% reduction in waste because up to that point, people had to drive their recycling to a drop-off or collection center. To your second question about composting and organics, it is a very hot topic right now. We as a waste reduction company are right in the middle of it because, frankly, the cities with the most success in organics are our cities. Okay, they're cities where you already have the residents incented, if you will, to divert these organic materials. In every city in which we operate a pay-as-you-throw program, the rate of folks using a backyard composter goes through the roof. Okay, I mean, it is in a residential single-family setting, it is the norm for people to compost in their yards. If we are fortunate enough to have a downtown or more dense urban core served by an organics program, by and large, that organics program is now successful because of the pay-as-you-throw system. And we manufacture, in those cases, a special organics bag that's been certified to degrade in the digester or in the whatever composting system they use. So we make sure that the bag will work with their organics program.
And this is Mark Dancy. I would just add that putting price into the equation, whether it's organics or whether it's hard to recycle items or plastic film or all these things that people want to see recycled at some point, it makes it all easier and more logical. The next steps become, doable, if you will. But if you leave trash as free, making those moves is going to be more and more difficult.
Well, why don't we have George do his presentation, and then we'll get back to some more of these questions.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. My presentation really breaks into two parts, a discussion of policy and politics. They're often intertwined. I'd just like to also go back to what Mark talked about, the immediate results. And I'd just tell you that my experience in government over the years is that a lot of elected officials live by the philosophy of NIMTOF, not in my term of office. In other words, if they have to take a big, courageous vote and the results aren't going to be seen, before the next election, they're going to have some real difficulty with that. The beauty of this program, as Mark pointed out in Fall River, for example, and certainly as we saw in Portland and we see in the other 44 communities in Maine that have adopted it, there are immediate as well as long-term results. Let me look with me for a minute at the slide that talks about policy and politics and how you transform through the two. You really do it by looking at a couple of key questions in each section. One, under policy, is a waste reduction plan right for our community? Is it right? How are things being handled? What's our system? How far along are we on the curve? Is it right for us? And which plan best meets our needs? Because there are a number of options out there in terms of waste reduction. Which plan or combination of plans can work best? And then, as you discuss those, and I'll talk about those on an upcoming slide, as you look at those pieces of policy questions, you move to the politics of it. Are our citizens really ready to take individual responsibility? When you have a blank check, you don't have to be accountable. You don't have to take responsibility. If you are educated to recycle, then you begin to take responsibility, but under the tragedy of commons, not everybody is. With a utility system, all of a sudden you have the same accountability that you heard growing up, which was turn the light off if you're out of the room. That's the philosophy of this. So are the citizens really willing to engage? And then, most importantly of all in politics, and most important, in my opinion, is champion. In my experience, when we were faced with some extraordinary cost challenges because of our solid waste, we were paying back in 1999, over $100 a ton to dispose of solid waste. I picked the most reluctant counselor that we had to lead a citizen and council investigatory group to come back to us with what was the best plan to reduce waste in our community. And that counselor came back after going to Worcester, where Mark had properly set it up and pushed for that. So policy and politics. If I could, I'd like to look at the policy slide with you. Policy is really about identifying the idea, whether it comes out of the media or professional organizations or industry itself, or through provocative research that individuals do and come up with what we can do. As I think has been mentioned, or should have been mentioned, we'll do more carbon-based reduction than any other program that you can begin to conceive of. And then you explore options, and that's what we were doing in Portland, looking whether we use consultants or citizens groups, but try to find out what options are out there for us, and finally evaluate those options so that when the council's looking into decision making, it really has some solid opportunities in front of it to study it. Let's go to politics for a minute. My favorite place is understanding the community concerns. You know, that of course there's resistance to change. And how many people on this webinar think that the general public has a high trust of government? That's a serious issue. There are financial concerns in the community. Again, in Portland's case, we were under a lot of pressure at the time. What you're doing, if you're squandering money on waste, and by the way, over the 15 years that we've adopted it, we've saved about $40 million. Our revenue and savings are about $40 million. We've reduced over 150,000 tons of solid waste during that period. So we actually get to make choices as communities when we're not squandering our money on this solid waste system. Gathering stakeholder support is important with your elected leaders, your staff leaders, relevant citizen groups, and the media. All of that has to come into play to really make the politics work. And then, obviously, you need to get your, whether it's a council system or a town meeting or a referendum, you have to get things lined up. In the same year we adopted pay-as-you-throw, we also banned cigarette smoking in restaurants, and we had to have a referendum. That referendum came up against us, and we won that. We prevailed. So that particular year, I knew the citizens were up for change. One was pay-as-you-throw, and two, just a pure quality of lifestyle issues. If I might, John, I'd go to the... And how can you help? How can you help in your communities? I think that engaged citizenry does the most to really help the politicians make decisions that are rational, that make wise policy choices for the community. And I think that creating working groups, identifying supporters, and reaching out to public officials just to raise their awareness, that you're concerned. You have environmental concerns, you have concerns about expenditure choices, because without some kind of metered system, you're making an extraordinary expenditure choice. $40 million, for example, in a small city like Portland, is money better applied to schools, better applied to a healthy infrastructure, better applied to economic development opportunities in our region, in our area. And as the slide says, if you really care about this issue and you feel that you can make a difference, you better be persistent. One of the reasons I'm attracted to, and it was, 13 years between I was mayor and when I met John Campbell and Mark Dancy, but I was attracted to Waste Zero and the mission here because they've proven persistence over the years, over a long term. And I think that if you and your communities get engaged in this, you know that there is an entity out here that won't let you down, that will stick with you. John?
If I could just say one thing, this is John Campbell, about George's persistence and ability to lead change and be a pioneer here. If we fast forward, over the last 15 years, Waste Zero has now converted 44 cities and towns, representing 31% of the population of the state of Maine. They have utility pricing, and we have cut the trash in half in all of those cities and towns. And so for the cities and towns that are considering this kind of policy change in 2015, believe me, it's a lot easier now that we have the data. We know what's going to happen. We know how, it's like when you take your kids to a scary movie, but you know how it's going to turn out if you can whisper to them, they're going to make it. Well, in this case, as Mark indicated, we know that 6 months after program implementation, the vast majority of your residents are going to see it as a positive. We know that the program is going to achieve the environmental and financial impacts that were predicted. We know we're in for a bit of a bumpy ride, but again, we have the benefit now after all these years and after having others like George who've led change to have that evidence and know that it's going to be just fine.
This is George again. I would just say there are a couple of points I should have, comments I would like to have made and I should add in now. And one is that I think that the communities are not being asked to blaze a trail anymore. They're asked to really follow a path as they get to this. And the real essential question, it seems to me, was featured in a recent magazine article, is can't we do better than this? If you look at the systems that most of the communities are using, that's the real question that the community needs to work with its council and its political leaders on. Can't we do better than this? And Portland, the answer was yes. And in many communities across this country now, the answer is getting to yes.
This is Mark, Dancy. I think just to build on what George said, why are we where we are? We talked about the way the billing system works, that it's in the taxes. It's kind of people's God-given right to have free garbage because it's always been there. But we're where we are because, if you look at how cities and towns started, and since we're so close to Jamestown, that's the good example. They had a dump in Jamestown, I'm sure, and every city and town since in this country has had a dump. And at some point, as we started changing the composition of our trash, and we started changing it first, and then later on we realized that it wasn't so good just to put it in the ground when you look at all the chemicals and so forth that are going in. We started rightly making better regulations for what to do with trash, how to bury trash. All those things started making burying trash a much more expensive proposition. And so one of the slides John didn't show shows how trash has gone up twice CPI in the last 30 years. Well, that's probably not going to change. And so you've seen this expansion of the budget. But what are we faced with? We're faced with change. That's really what we're faced with as a company. How do we initiate and make a change? Because we know that if the situation was different, if your city or town was currently paying in a pay-as-you-throw type system, and someone came to you with the proposition of, we want to go to an all-you-can-eat trash model. We want to double your costs, double your amount of trash, cut your recycling in half. They'd get laughed right out of the room. But that's the system most cities and towns have today. And it's simply a function of how things have evolved. And now people have to make a change. And we feel like in New England and New York and some places we're reaching a tipping point where neighbors and neighboring towns have had so much success, it's becoming, there's pressure on cities and towns to change just from their citizenry. And the rest of the country may be a little bit further behind. But it's moving, and eventually, just like water meters and electric meters, I can't imagine we're going to live in a country with unmetered garbage.
I have a question. So have you seen any evidence of sort of a growing movement within sort of manufacturing and retail communities to sort of respond to these pay-as-you-throw systems by helping to reduce packaging? I mean, this is going to date me, but I remember in the late 80s when I was in college, there was that big movement to get all the music companies to stop putting CDs in the large packages. They used to have so much cardboard that came with them, and they went to just providing the jewel case. And so that was a big, and there was a big movement for lots of people to start thinking about packaging. Have you seen anything on that end in response to an increasing number of citizens who are facing this pay-as-you-throw system?
This is John Campbell. We actually just received in 2014 an endorsement from, help me with the name, Mark, the American Packaging Association, suggesting that all cities and towns adopt a unit-based or pay-as-you-throw pricing model. Why did they want that to happen? Because packagers also want to reduce the amount of material that they use. They'd like to have consumers tuned in. And so, yes, we've seen it at the highest levels. And those same packaging companies are ecstatic with the amount of recycled material that we provide for them, because they are consistently, Coke and Pepsi specifically, but all bottlers are short of recycled PET plastic to make their bottles from, and aluminum. They'd like to have more material. And when we double the recycling volume in a city or town, they see that difference in their material recovery facility within 2 months. It's double.
So why don't we, this would be a good time, I think, to try and get some responses from the people who are listening to the webinar. So we have a couple poll questions. And I think what we'll do now is launch our first poll question. And then while you guys are responding to this poll, maybe I'll ask another question of our speakers today. So a couple of people have written in sort of just kind of wanting to know more about how you really make the money work. So obviously, a big thing that we're doing is we're shifting this cost to consumers at a specific point. But do most municipalities then reduce the flat fee on garbage? Do taxes come down? How does that work out?
So we've had some great questions, because this is our challenge as a business. Is we've got this great value proposition about essentially changing the efficiency of your solid waste department and reducing your costs dramatically. And that's a great, easy value proposition to sell. The fact that it comes along with a new fee, a user fee that helps drive that change, is complex, because it would be nice to say that fee will be put over in a I'll use the term lockbox, but it'll be a trust fund, and or it will go to reduce a millage rate down the road and proportionally. In my experience, and George may want to comment on this too, very few cities and towns actually follow through with that. So our challenge is one of trust too, with our, not as a company, but when we go and interject ourselves into the process, work with a city or town, it would be wonderful if they would say, we're going to reduce taxes this much. Most of them do not. They keep the revenue, they keep the savings. And so the citizens are looking at, yes, it makes more sense. And yes, in the long run, as George said, those dollars are going to go into better choices. But you have a skeptical public, and there's a concern. So our best case is where cities and towns have already adopted a separate garbage fee. And in those cases, it's much easier to lower or reduce that fee in an amount that corresponds to the new revenue. But that is our challenge. If we could have the benefits of the user fee without having the user fee, this would be a much easier sale.
This is George Campbell again. I would just go on and say another alternative, and I wish we had looked at it this way in Portland at the inception of the program, is to do a 10-year estimate of the kind of financial savings you would get and tie that to a specific program that's not being funded, that needs to be funded. For example, one of the communities we're talking to today, a sizable community, is looking at a significant capital program for road improvement. Their local streets have really deteriorated, and they're looking at the cost of that, and they're looking if they could finance a bond to do that from the savings and revenue that they would get from adopting a pay-as-you-throw. So I think there's abstract concept that you can slow down the tax rate increases or decrease them, but I think that part of a policy choice, at least an alternative to consider if you're championing it from the mayor's office or the council, is to say, by doing this, by stopping this wasteful practice, we could generate revenue and savings that allow us to do this, to upgrade a school, to build a park, to do whatever we want that we just can't do under the stresses and strains we have in local government today.
Great. Well, so the poll was sort of 100%. Everybody believing that it is possible to cut trash in half as an attainable goal. So we have another poll question that we'll launch, and while people are completing that poll question, let me ask you a question about, have you ever tried to do this in a place that has private trash hauling, where the citizens currently are contracting with private trash haulers and then they're converting to the municipal pay-as-you-throw?
We have, and so it really depends on the city ordinance how they want to do it. But I'll give you a larger view. We are working with the state of Rhode Island right now, and they have 39 cities and towns, and they have a different. Each city and town has their own solid waste system. And what the state is saying, or at least the state-owned landfill is saying, there's only one landfill left in the state. There are no waste-energy facilities. So at the end of the day, in 20 to 24 years, they're not going to have any place to bury or burn garbage in the entire state. So they're going to have lost control. And what they're trying to do is extend the life of that asset by reducing trash. And so they are looking at, and we're assisting them in this process, a sort of a jump, if you will, that every resident in whatever is defined as residential trash, whether they have a private hauler or they take it to a city-owned or town-managed transfer station, or they have city curbside pickup, buys the Rhode Island landfill bag, and they pay their fee directly to the landfill. Cities and towns and private haulers no longer pay a landfill fee, provided they take their trash to the landfill in the appropriate bags. So that is making it a just essentially the transactions now between the resident and the landfill, and the private hauler still charges based on their rate to pick up the garbage and that logistical part of it, but the disposal of it will be paid directly to the landfill. So, but we do that in smaller, in other communities as well. The more common model is for the city or town to, just write the ordinance based on the residents who are using their system, and those that opt out can opt out.
Great. So the second response to the poll has also been overwhelmingly positive, so that all of our webinar attendees would be willing to support their community in taking steps to reduce its trash. So I think you guys have done a good job of convincing perhaps an already persuaded audience. But let me just have you guys, we only have a couple minutes left, is, what do you need to have this be successful? Are there key things that you need in the municipalities and the cities that you go to know that this will be a successful program?
This is John, and I'll go first. I would say that we have so much of what we need. We have the evidence. We have a company that's purpose-built to partner with communities to do this. We have people like George and literally hundreds of others who've converted their communities, who will come to a new community and explain their experience. Once you've done this, once you've had the experience of sort of living through the change process and looking at what you've achieved, it's quite satisfying. So we've come so far. I'd say that the real challenges are, going back to George's slide, at this point, we have a lack of awareness in most of the country that this is even a possibility. Okay, having the opportunity to talk with William and Mary alums today is critically important. A lot of what we do as a company is about educating the public and letting people know, whether they're elected officials or staff members, policymakers, that there is this possibility that we can cut trash in half in the United States, and it will start in your town. Once we have folks tuned into that proposition, as George said, it's really having a driver. Once you enter the realm of politics, you need a change agent. You need a person or a group of people who are going to say, I ran for elected office for a reason. I'm filling this seat. And if I have the opportunity to take 5 or 7 or 10% out of the city budget and cut the trash in half forever, that's worth doing. That's different from the other 10 things that I'm looking at that I might achieve as a council person. And yes, it may be harder than the other 10 things, but it's worth it. Let's go do this. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think that John answered pretty much what I would have said. I would only, this is George Campbell, I would just only add to it that you need a pressure point, and that can be your citizens demanding change and rationality. That can be extraordinary budget pressures, but you need that kind of pressure to really affect the change.
All right, well, that's been great. Thank you so much for coming today, all three of you, and participating in this webinar. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. And please check back and see what other webinars we have for you in the future.